from The Dollhouse, a ghost story by Charis, Cotter. And I hope you enjoy it. We're going to read the prelude and then the first chapter. Fits. I slept for a long, long time. Now and then, sounds filtered through heavy layers of sleep. The murmur of voices, faint, faraway music. Summer rain pattering on the roof. Birds chattering high in the branches of trees. Wind whistling around the corners of the house. Thunder. People calling each other. Children laughing. Someone walking in the garden, singing. And every so often, the train whistle, blowing sharp and lonely through the night, rising and falling as the train approached, passed, and then faded away into the distance. I turned over with a sigh in my soft, high bed and fell deeper into sleep. I slept for a long, long time. Chapter 1. The Train. The train rumbled through the gathering dusk. Every so often it gave a long, mournful hoot that echoed through the countryside. I shivered. Our house was near the railway tracks in the city, and I'd always loved hearing that lonely, haunting sound when I lay safe and warm in bed at night. But it was very different to be inside the whistling train, in the very heart of that desolate cry, hurtling into an unknown future, with my mother sitting rigid beside me, tears falling in a steady stream down her face. We had been on the train for 5 hours. I first noticed that she was crying somewhere in the middle of hour 1, and her tears had been ebbing and flowing ever since. Every now and then, I reached out and gave her hand a squeeze, and she'd come out of it for a moment, shaking away the tears impatiently and wiping at her face with the handkerchief she kept gripped in her fist. "I'm all right," she would say. "I'm fine." But a little while later, when I turned back to her from the hypnotic view of houses, trees, and roads, the tears were slipping down her face again, and her eyes looked far away at something that was not visible to me. It was all wrong. Tonight we were supposed to be in a rental cottage with Dad by a small lake far to the north of the city. We'd arranged for me to get out of school a week early because these 2 weeks were the only time he could get off work. He traveled a lot, and lately it seemed like we hardly ever saw him. We hadn't had a summer holiday together for years, and we were all looking forward to it. At least I thought we were. Yesterday, when I came home from school, charging happily into the kitchen, bubbling over with that fizzy school's over feeling, I ran smack into a big fight. Mom was yelling, "It's the last straw, Stephen. I won't take it anymore." And he was shrugging his shoulders, saying calmly, "What can I do? It's my job." And then Mom started yelling again, "If you loved us, you would make this holiday happen the way you promised. You never keep your promises to me or Alice, and I told you if you let us down this time, I was leaving. That's it." Then she turned and saw me, standing at the door with my heavy knapsack full of everything I'd cleaned out of my desk from the year at school. Notebooks and books and markers and colored pencils. "Alice," she said, her face crumbling. "I'm sorry, honey. We're not going to the cottage. Your dad can't make it, so none of us are going." I looked from one to the other. "Dad? Mom?" "I'm sorry, Allie. I'm really sorry, but I absolutely have to be in LA tomorrow. It came up last minute." "It always comes up at the last minute," yelled my mom. "I warned you, and as always, you didn't listen. We're done." "Done?" I said in a squeaky voice. "I'm leaving you, Stephen," said my mom, "and I'm taking Alice with me." My knapsack fell to the floor with a thud. "For goodness sake, Ellie, don't be so dramatic," said my dad. She shook her head, tears falling, and picked up the telephone. "Who are you calling?" he demanded. "The Wilsons. I'm canceling the cottage." "What are you talking about? We'll lose our deposit. You and Alice can still go." My mother spoke remarkably calmly into the telephone. "This is Ellie Green. I'm calling to cancel our booking at the cottage. There has been a family emergency. Please call me back when you get this message." She hung up the phone just as my father lurched toward her to try and grab it. "It's done, Stephen," she said. "Go to LA. Alice and I will not be here when you get back." I stood gaping at her, feeling the floor tilting beneath my feet as my family slipped sideways and fell in pieces. That was yesterday. Dad left an hour later to catch a flight to Los Angeles, where a building project urgently needed his attention for the next few weeks. He hugged me before he left, the familiar peppery smell of his expensive aftershave filling my nose as he held me longer than usual. When he pulled away, he automatically smoothed down his snappy designer jacket, in case I'd wrinkled it, like he always did. But his eyes were full of tears and his mouth was tight. "I'm sorry, Allie," he said, his voice cracking. "We'll fix this, I promise." Behind us, my mother snorted. She was really mad, and we all knew how many times he'd promised things would be different, and they never were. This afternoon, Mom and I boarded the train to Lakeport, a small town a 6-hour ride from the city. Mom made a few phone calls last night and accepted a job there looking after an old lady who had broken her leg. My mother's a nurse and works on contract. The agency had called her earlier in the week to see if she would take this job, and now they were happy to hear she was available after all. It started right away in a live-in position, and a 12-year-old daughter was no problem. Lots of room, they said, a big house. I didn't see why we couldn't go to the cottage and leave Dad after our holiday, if we had wanted to leave him at all, but Mom was determined. Maybe she thought if she postponed it, she would lose her nerve. So now here we are on the train, speeding into the future, with lush green countryside flashing by and tears trickling down my mother's face. I watched as the city gave way to suburbs, then green fields framed by rows of trees, then a few farmhouses, some small towns, and finally, the lake. The lake was enormous. The train ran close to the shore for a while, and all I could see was water going on and on to the horizon. Then the train veered inland again and rattled along past farms and villages, rivers and woods. When we went through small towns, the train slowed down, and I stared into backyards at swing sets, flower gardens, and kids playing. As the light began to fade, some of the windows lit up, and I had brief glimpses inside kitchens and living rooms. I wondered about all those people's lives, and I was filled with a sense of longing. If only we could stop, walk into one of those kitchens, and find Dad waiting for us. Then go on with our lives in another place where everything was okay and there was no fighting. It could happen. We could get off the train and drive away from the station, up a hill and into a house where we were a happy family. I could see my mother smiling at my dad and him taking off his glasses to give her a hug. Wait a minute, my dad didn't wear glasses. This was a different dad, a chubby, comfortable kind of dad who wore old flannel shirts and baggy pants, with a bald spot and a job that didn't involve getting into airplanes and flying away from us. I glanced at my mother. The tears had stopped, but she was still gripping the handkerchief tightly in one hand, and she still had that sad, faraway look in her eyes. I sighed and looked out the window again. I didn't really want a new dad. I loved my dad, but I had a bad habit of getting lost in my imagination. Sometimes it got me into trouble. Not just trouble from my teachers and Mom, who were constantly telling me to stop daydreaming and pay attention to real life. That was nothing. I mean, serious trouble. When I would scare myself so much that I would forget what was real and what was just in my head. One time, when my mom was half an hour late coming home, I thought maybe she had a car accident. And then I saw the accident happening, and then I saw me and Dad at her funeral, and we were packing up her clothes and bringing them to the local thrift store. Then Dad got a girlfriend, and they got married, and I had a wicked stepmother, and it went on from there. I got so lost in the story that when my mother came in the door complaining that the traffic had held her up, I was so happy to see her there instead of lying dead in a graveyard, that I threw myself into her arms sobbing. That took a little explaining. The problem is that this kind of thing happens to me all the time, every day. I always have stories running in my mind, some good, some bad. I try to stop myself when I get started on a bad one, but it's hard to put on the brakes. I get caught up in it before I realize what's happening. And ever since Mom and Dad have been fighting so much, my fantasies have veered way out of control. Mom and I shivering in a horrible apartment with no heat and people being murdered down the hall and drug deals gone wrong while Dad moves to Singapore and forgets all about us. A horrible custody battle where I have to choose between them. Mom getting a boyfriend who I hate. Dad getting a girlfriend who hates me. These worst-case divorce scenarios made me feel even more sick about them fighting, but I just couldn't stop. Now that it had finally happened, it was a relief in a way. At least I wasn't an orphan in foster care with both of them dead or in prison. I tried to look on the bright side. Maybe Dad would finish early in LA, come looking for us and talk Mom into going home. Maybe we could rent the cottage after all, later in summer maybe. Or maybe not. I gazed out at the landscape. It had changed. We were running through the woods now, thick stands of trees. The train seemed to have picked up speed, swaying from side to side. It gave a sudden lurch, then kept barreling forward. I looked over at Mom. I began. Isn't it going kind of fast? She turned and I watched her eyes slowly focus on me as she pulled her attention back from what the sad place she'd been in ever since we boarded the train. What did you say, honey? The train lurched again. The train, isn't it going a bit too fast? She looked out the window. Trees were flashing by. Oh, I'm sure it's fine. They speed up between towns. I wasn't so sure. I'd heard about train accidents. Trains that kept gathering speed, and then they'd run off the tracks, leaving upside-down rail cars smoking, bloody bodies, people stumbling through the wreckage. No, I stopped myself. I didn't want to get lost in a gory train wreck fantasy. I think about Dad again, and how maybe he would come next week, and this would all be over, and we could be a happy family. That's when it happened. With a tremendous screech, the train came to a sudden grinding halt, and I slammed forward into the seat in front of me. Everything went black. So, this is the story of Alice, and her world's kind of falling apart around her. Her parents are getting a divorce, or they're splitting up, and they're moving into this giant mansion where her mom can care for this old lady. And in the attic, she finds this dollhouse that's an exact replica of the house that they just moved into. And one morning she wakes up, and in bed with her is a girl that looks suspiciously like one of the dolls in the dollhouse. And the dollhouse keeps changing without anyone moving it. And so Alice sees this as a mystery that she needs to solve. If you like books like Doll Bones or Small Spaces, this would be a great book for you. We have it in our school library. You can find it at your public library, or you can always buy your own copy. Happy reading.